Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3 lessons learned. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. We have an agenda on this first slide. We will cover a little bit of housekeeping information, talk briefly about Perry Johnson Registrars as a certification body, cover the benefits of certification at a high level, and then we'll get into the finer details of the presentation, including common NCRs that we've seen so far in our experiences with R2V3 and some lessons learned. Towards the end of the presentation, I will provide an overview of the certification process and we'll close with questions. So feel free to type those in at any point. Some housekeeping details. Again, as I mentioned, we'll go through that quickly. Today's presentation is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be made available on PJR's website in the next couple of days, as well as a copy of the slides themselves. You can type questions in at any point in the GoToWebinar questions field. I will save time for those at the end, so I'm going to save those for later, but type them in as they come to you so you don't forget. The presentation is a compilation of PJR's experience. However, CIRI is ultimately the controlling body or deciding body for all things formal interpretation. So I encourage everyone to get familiar with CIRI's website, specifically the R2V3 knowledge base portion of the website. It offers a significant amount of training materials, Q&As, podcasts, interpretation explanations, a whole host of information. They get into a lot more detail than I can in an hour-long webinar, as well as just our limitations as a certification body to not cross that consulting line. So if you're not already familiar with that website, I encourage you to do so. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified clients to a variety of standards around the world. This list of countries is not an all-inclusive list, but it does speak to our global presence as a certification body. Speaking of standards, the accreditations we hold cover a wide breadth of standards. Obviously, today we are talking about the R2 standard. Some of these other standards may look familiar to you depending on what standards your management system currently integrates for R2. Benefits of certification vary by standard, by industry, by location, but most of these are common factors. The standard itself represents a commitment to responsible reuse and recycling of electronics and components. So being able to advertise that commitment hand in hand with the certification is one of the key benefits to maintaining the certification. Improving the organization's environmental health and safety performance is another factor or common benefit. Going through the requirements to implement and maintain certified environmental health and safety management systems do drive improvements inherently to the organization's environmental health and safety performance. The standard represents a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements, again, by adhering to and implementing the expectations within the standard, customer and/or regulatory requirements are part of that activity, especially in the prerequisite standards that the R2V3 standard requires the facility to maintain, such as RIOS, ISO 14001, ISO 45001. Management commitment and employee engagements are additional benefits that go hand in hand with implementing and maintaining certified management systems. Being able to advertise the certification and that commitment that we spoke about earlier can provide a competitive advantage over organizations that do not hold the same certification, and or improved public image. Being able to relay to potential customers the certification and what it represents may give them additional security or make them feel more comfortable sharing their electronics that might contain data, for example. Or it can give a representative to, it may represent the company's sustainability efforts to promote reuse over recycling or materials recovery activities. In addition to the competitive advantage and improved public image that we just spoke about, there could be other potential financial benefits. In some areas, certain standard certifications or certain certifications may result in an insurance premium discount, for example. Excuse me. Achieving strategic objectives and or stakeholder requirements are another possible benefit of certification. So we mentioned earlier how maintaining the requirements of the standard promotes a framework for meeting customer and or regulatory requirements. The same can be said for meeting these objectives and requirements. The standard is able to be integrated with other business management systems. So depending on the other systems or certifications for which your organization is interested, the ability to integrate those expectations and not create as much extra work, if they align well, that is another benefit of certification. Again, those benefits vary by facility, but just a high-level overview of some of those common factors. We're going to get into next the most common sources of NCRs, and we do track the NCRs as a certification body. This is data that is owed to CIRI on a regular basis. So we do have this data available, and the slides for this presentation will be revised if those trends shift, if we see an emphasis on NCRs in a different area or of a different nature, or conversely, certain types of NCRs sort of trailing off as the industry addresses those concerns overall. So for now, in no particular order, or I should say, not in order of frequency necessarily, we have some of the more common NCRs. Appendix A is definitely one of the most common sources of NCRs. Appendix A is the downstream vendor management process requirement, and these NCRs vary in nature, but typically include one or more of these expectations not being met. So we see findings against Appendix A for incomplete records of due diligence or downstream management sufficient to meet the requirements of Appendix A. We see clients having miscounted their downstream vendors or misrepresenting their R2V3 certification status. So as a reminder, if a downstream vendor is not R2V3, they are considered non-R2 by the R2V3 standard. R2 2013 is not equivalent to the R2V3 certification, and accordingly, for Appendix A, the downstream vendor count affects audit time and audit duration. So having that count correct is important. It also directly affects the amount or the extent of downstream due diligence that's required, whether a downstream vendor is R2V3 certified or not. So a common source of NCR is perhaps an organization thinking their downstream vendor is R2V3 certified, where the auditor determines or identifies that they are not R2V3 certified. Perhaps they're still R2 2013 and have not transitioned yet, or perhaps they are no longer R2 certified at all, in which case additional due diligence is warranted. So not having that due diligence accounted for would result in a finding against Appendix A. The requirement to verify downstream vendors meet the applicable appendix requirements as relevant is another common source of NCR for Appendix A in R2V3. So when you read through Section 8, I believe it is, in Appendix A, where it goes into detail about the non-R2V3 downstream vendors and what due diligence is required, there are additional requirements if certain activities are going to be conducted by the downstream vendor on the R2V3 facility's behalf or in lieu of the R2V3 facility doing those activities in-house. So an example of this might be that the R2V3 facility doesn't conduct data sanitization in-house. Instead, it sends it to a downstream vendor for data sanitization. So verifying that not only are the Appendix A downstream due diligence requirements met from a general perspective, but also those additional requirements for downstream vendors conducting data sanitization, essentially equivalent to Appendix B requirements. Similarly, if test or repair is sent to a downstream vendor instead of performed in-house, you'll see in Appendix A those additional requirements for a downstream vendor doing those testing or repair activities. So those are common sources of NCRs with Appendix A. And the last one there is having pollution liability insurance for organizations that process negative value equipment. So this NCR is commonly coming from one of two sources. The first being a lack of understanding about what negative value equipment is. So you need to get familiar with that from an R2V3 perspective. Check out the standard, the applicability, check out the definition on the CRE knowledge base website. Understand what that means before you make a determination or try and make a justification that doesn't apply to your organization. If you're processing negative value equipment, you are required to maintain pollution liability insurance under Appendix A. The other source of this NCR tends to be I don't want to say misunderstanding necessarily, but it appears that clients sometimes get the exemptions or exceptions for maintaining a financial instrument in Core 9 confused with the pollution liability insurance requirement in Appendix A. So there are no exceptions or exemptions to pollution liability insurance. Either you process negative value equipment and you need it, or you don't process negative value equipment and you don't need it. So those are the two common sources for that particular NCR. Appendix B contains so many requirements. We're not going to get into them today. They are very detailed and they depend on whether you're doing logical, physical, or both. So at a high level, the common NCRs with Appendix B include not accounting for some of the requirements within the appendix for your processes in the facility. So perhaps you haven't accounted for the need for video surveillance of physical destruction activities, for example. Another common source of NCR for Appendix B is incomplete documentation of process requirements. So perhaps your process meets the expectations, perhaps it doesn't, but this particular finding relates to the data sanitization plan or the data documented procedures not meeting the requirements of Appendix B. Some examples we see for Appendix B findings, to get a little bit more specific than those really general expectations, include clients not using software for sanitization and or validation, even though that is expressly required by the standard, not maintaining those video recordings, as I mentioned, making sure that the physical destruction types qualify under Appendix B rather than Core 7. Let's see, implementing unique identifiers, having gaps in the data sanitization plan, not addressing the training and competency requirements. The list goes on because, as I mentioned, there are a whole host of requirements within Appendix B. I have summarized Appendix C similarly. The NCRs could be coming from the processes themselves not being implemented in a way that meets Appendix C requirements, or gaps in the documentation for Appendix C requirements, such as the reuse plan. Some examples here, maintaining individualized records for testing, accounting for all media types when you are outlining your testing protocols, gaps in the reuse plan documentation. If the, let's see, if the materials are being tested and repair is not accounted for, either through the facility scope or a downstream vendor, then Core 2 isn't really being adhered to. If anything that requires repair is being scrapped, we can't say that we're prioritizing reuse. So Appendix C is another common source of NCR, and as a reminder, for Appendix C, you do also need a Certified Quality Management System certificate. Again, we're going in order here, so this is not necessarily in order of frequency or volume. Core requirement 1, we see common NCRs related to not including relevant names in the contract for certification. Does the organization have a DBA? Does it operate under more than one name, perhaps for resale purposes or for testing? I'm trying to think of some other examples. But the relevant names are required to be included for R2V3. The scheme for the certification can potentially be misrelayed. SIRI and R2V3 have a specific definition of what a campus looks like, for example, and how they need to interact. If this is misrepresented, it could possibly be provided with the wrong scheme. This affects scoping, this affects the scheduling of the audits, the contract structure, the audit time, the audit duration. So this is a big one, to make sure that you are providing enough detail and that the information being relayed is accurate. The scope verbiage is significant in that it is prescribed by the Code of Practices. So again, those appendices, those process requirements need to be accurate. It's not like R2 2013 where the scope verbiage is fairly flexible and client organizations have a good deal of say as to what their scope looks like. So it's important to accurately identify the applicable appendices, the types of electronics being processed, so that the scope is not misleading. Core requirement 3 The most common NCR is related to the expectation of performing the risk assessment, the exposure evaluation, and potentially monitoring those exposures if found to be relevant. So this is above and beyond the expectations for the ISO 14001, 45001, or RIOS. This is found in Core 3. We don't want to make the assumption that maintaining those certifications for certified EHS standards fulfills this requirement of Core 3. This would be above and beyond what is required there because it's specific to the R2V3 expectations and electronics. That's a common NCR against Core 3. Core 5, a common NCR here is incomplete summaries of transactions. So the inbound and outbound summaries are to account for all product moving in and out of the facility. Core 6, we may see gaps in the processes themselves, insufficiencies in the processes themselves, or we could see insufficiencies in the documentation. So the reuse plan isn't required by Core 6. However, processes and plans for meeting Core 6 are required. This could look like expectations for categorizing materials, maintaining adequate test records, suitable sorting to ensure the subsequent processing method is appropriate, incorporating the categories or expectations of the rec, sampling as required. For example, if material is received already tested and graded in accordance with the rec, with a robust understanding of that upstream's testing protocols, then a sampling is required to confirm those results. So those are just some examples of the common NCRs for Core 6. Similarly to Appendix B, but found in the core instead, so applicable to all R2V3 facilities, would be insufficiencies in the process or documentation. Once again, some examples could include the data sanitization plan, missing required elements, training criteria not being met, insufficient controls or identification of all pre-sanitized media, not maintaining the required acknowledgements, not maintaining the required independent security audits. The list goes on. There is quite a bit in Core 7 as well. But the findings against Core 7 are common and do tend to be either gaps in the documentation or insufficiencies in the process. Core 9 commonly reflects NCRs for gaps in the closure plan expectations, insufficient financial instruments, and sometimes this is more related to the documentation of the financial instrument rather than the financial instrument itself, although sometimes the financial instrument itself is also not sufficient. As a reminder, just as with R2 2013, inventory is not acceptable, is not permitted to be used to cover closure costs. And company-owned assets are not sufficient in their own right to cover to substantiate the financial instrument or cover closure costs. Because in the event of abandonment, Series' position is that any valuable assets will be liquidated prior to abandonment or seized by the bank to collect for other debts. So the only way that wholly owned assets can be used as a financial instrument are if they are used as collateral to secure a surety bond or some other mechanism to ensure that the value is used to cover closure costs in the event of abandonment. The other common NCR for Core 9 would be insufficient insurance coverage evidence. Even companies with one and only one employee are required to meet the insurance coverage found in Core 9. Lessons learned include, obviously, the common NCRs that we have already discussed. I mentioned earlier the importance of identifying the correct appendices. Because it can affect so many factors: audit time, scoping, scheduling of audits, a number of things, even the prerequisite standards that are required. Going hand in hand with that, some of those appendices require a quality management system certification. So to misidentify the appendices could also possibly miss this requirement or include it unnecessarily, which can be a financial strain. Hand in hand with the appendix applicability also goes the scope verbiage. Again, this is prescriptive and found within the Code of Practices. Specific verbiage correlates to each of the appendices depending on the selections made within those appendices. For example, for Appendix B, is an organization doing logical sanitization only, or physical data destruction only, or both? This would have a direct impact on both audit time and the scope verbiage. The NCR closure deadlines are outlined in the Code of Practice, as well as Advisory 22 for transition audits. So again, we see some really prescriptive information that needs to be adhered to. The NCR closure deadlines have been a challenge to navigate for clients and auditors. All R2V3 NCRs are required to be closed with a revisit. It's no longer up to the auditor's discretion. The revisits cannot be off-site. They must be virtual or on-site, depending on the nature of the finding. There are 60 and 90-day expectations, and the ramifications for not meeting those deadlines are significant. They can include suspension of certification, repeating the audit. That can have a really significant impact for our clients. So that is a challenge to navigate, as I mentioned. I definitely encourage clients to review those expectations, work through their NCRs as efficiently as they can. You want to close them the right way, but you can't sit on them for very long. Like I said, the ramifications for not meeting those deadlines are significant. The facility schemes are somewhat challenging. They do not necessarily follow the same terminology or definitions as some of the other standards, even compared to R2 2013. So we see the discontinuation of multi-sites with R2V3, for example. The majority of clients who were multi-sites under R2 2013 are single facility schemes under R2V3, contracted and audited individually. while R2V3 does have a campus scheme, it is not always applicable to multiple locations. They have to be interacting with each other to an extent sufficient enough to justify the campus scheme is applicable. Material needs to be moving back and forth to jointly process the material and fulfill a joint scope. Typically, the expectation is that at least one of the sites within a campus scheme would not be eligible for certification without the other. So they don't fulfill all of the core requirements themselves, for example. That's the expectation for the campus scheme. There are other schemes, less common, including shared facilities, common parent, group. These are not scheme names that we are used to or had encountered with R2 2013. So that is something else to pay close attention to. Virtual audits are a learning experience as well. For R2V3 audits, only certain types of audits are allowed to be conducted virtually as approved by the Code of Practices and the relevant SERI advisories. For example, transition audits are eligible for virtual auditing if the client organization is a good candidate and certain criteria can be met. This includes auditor training, electronic sharing of documents within a specified time frame. There's a hard and fast deadline before a virtual transition that those documents are due to be eligible for a fully virtual transition. After the transition and the R2V3 certificate is issued, only one of the two surveillances can go even partially virtual. The other must be fully on site for R2V3. Recertification audits are required to be on site for R2V3, and stage 2 audits are required to be on site for R2V3. We still also see restrictions with facility move audits where on-site time is required within 6 months if the move audit is conducted virtually. There are additional expectations, as I mentioned, for auditor training for fully virtual transitions. There's additional audit time for fully virtual transitions. So there are robust expectations for virtual auditing in R2V3 as well. For anyone pursuing initial certification, I have included in these slides an overview of the certification process. Obtaining a copy of the standard is the first step. You then would establish the documentation needed to meet the standard requirements. You would conduct training to adhere to the requirements prescribed within the standard, implement the requirements of the standard in the management system, including an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, a management review. The management review is to take place after those audits so that the outputs of the audits can serve as inputs for the meeting, the management review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct the audits, and you'll need to submit any pre-qualification information required for the contract review activity prescribed or required by the Code of Practices. At PJR, we call this activity the contract validation. After successful completion of the contract validation, which confirms eligibility for R2V3 certification, initial certifications, not transition audits, would take place as stage 1 and then stage 2 audits. Any resulting nonconformities do need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. Once the certificate is issued, we'll get into what that cycle looks like on the next slide. But just a little bit more detail about those audits. The contract validation is an offsite activity, again, to confirm eligibility for R2V3 certification. For stage 1 clients, that activity is at least a half day. For transition clients, it is typically a quarter day. Stage 1 audits are primarily focused on documentation. I wouldn't say exclusively. It also evaluates your readiness for stage 2. R2V3 requires even stage 1 audits to identify nonconformances if they are found. Rather than the full root cause and corrective action expectations for stage 1 nonconformances, correction only is required, but they do need to be resolved before proceeding to stage 2. So you might even see a stage 1 revisit, depending on the number and nature of findings. The stage 2 audit is a on-site audit, as I mentioned, due to the virtual audit requirements of the Code of Practices, and it encompasses the entire management system. Any nonconformities identified at a stage 2 need to be resolved through the whole correction, root cause, corrective action process before a certificate can be issued. And again, the R2V3 stage 2 time is required to be on site. Once certified, you have 2 years worth of surveillance audits. These can be annual or semi-annual depending on the contract and would be shorter in duration than the stage 2 as they reflect partial system audits. Recertification audit takes place the 3rd year of the cycle. These would again be on site per the Code of Practice requirements. Any nonconformities need to be resolved before a new certificate could be issued and the 3-year cycle begins anew. If you haven't already typed your questions in, please feel free to do so now. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide that has my contact information on it. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. You can reach out to me via email or the main PJR line to be put through to my extension if you have any technical questions to discuss. I've also included the contact information for the sales department. Should you be interested in a quote for certification or to begin that process, you can reach out to them by phone. Okay, I do see someone with their hand up, but if you don't mind, please type your question into the question field instead. I would appreciate that. Thank you. I'll wait and see if anyone is typing. Again, today's presentation is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be available in the next couple of days, as well as a copy of the slides. Feel free to reach out to me if you don't see them on there in a couple of days. You can reach out to me by phone or email. Email would be my preference. I do work part-time. It makes it easier for me to get back with you. If you have your transition audit coming up, I hope this information is helpful. Even if you don't have a transition audit, if you've already transitioned and you have a surveillance audit, hopefully the lessons learned in common NCRs can help you have a more successful audit. You can go back and review those sections in more detail and assess whether your processes or documentation could be strengthened prior to your next audit. And if you are preparing for initial certification, again, I do hope the content is helpful in helping you prepare. Okay, so we do have one question. If certifying to R2V3 with appendices A, B, and C, and RIOS is a separate certification, do Do the quality requirements in RIOS suffice, or is ISO 9001 required? So I think this question is asking whether RIOS fulfills the quality management certification requirements for the appendices that require a certified QMS. And the answer is yes. If you take a look at the CIRI Knowledge Base website, there is a page, and you can use the search function that lists all of the quality management certifications that fulfill that quality requirement for R2V3. RIOS is one of them. ISO 9001 is another, and there are several others that fulfill the QMS requirement. RIOS is uniquely positioned in that it encompasses the quality, environmental, and health and safety prerequisites for R2V3. So companies that have an R2V3 RIOS combination aren't required to have ISO 14001 and ISO 45001. RIOS suffices the EHS requirements as well as the quality management system requirements. Only certain appendices require a quality management system. Those are Appendix C, D, and F. The rest of the appendices do not require a certified QMS, and all R2V3 facilities are required to have certified environmental health and safety management systems, except for a subset of brokers. So I hope that answers your question, Nancy. You can have RIOS instead of ISO 9001 to meet the QMS requirements. That is correct. I'll hang out for another moment to see if anyone else is typing so far. That was the only question that has come through. You're welcome. Again, feel free to send me an email if you have any questions that come up after the training has completed or you think of something else you would like to discuss. No more questions. So I am going to sign off for today. I hope you have a great afternoon and tune into future revisions of this webinar or some of the other subjects on which we offer webinars through PJR. Thank you and have a great day.